Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is the Worm Whisperer here. I just want to thank everybody for showing up at the channel today. Today we're going to go over what to do when worms are sick. I'll give you some tips on what to look for, and I'll also give you some tips on what to do if you do find out that there is some issues with your worms. Okay, so now to start, we're going to look for some things that could indicate that your worms are sick. So we want to look them. You want to check them on a regular basis. You want to check for any worms that don't look healthy, that look sluggish, that look like they're dying in the bin. Anything like that you want to check for. So one of the first things you can look for is the temperature. So if the temperature is too hot or too cold in your bin, the worms are either going to be sluggish and slow moving if it's too cold, and they're going to be coming basically to the top and to the sides if it's too hot. So if you've got a lot of organic matter, like this is old apple in here, if you've got too much of that in there, the center of this is going to heat up. The bacteria is going to heat up the center of this, and it's going to get way too hot, and the worms are going to basically try to get away from that. They're either going to come up to the top and try to get out, or they're going to come around the edges, and you'll see a lot of them around the edges like this of bin. So the next thing you want to look for is moisture. The worms can get extremely wet and they can't breathe very well, and they're also going to get sluggish when it's too wet like that. So you're going to want to make sure the bin is not overly saturated. This bin here is pretty good. It's not too wet. You see the worms in there are pretty healthy. They're moving around. So basically, the worms want to be in a bedding that's essentially like a wet sponge. So if you were to pick up this and you were to squeeze it like this, you want just a tiny little bit of water to come out of it. Just enough so you can say there's water in there. You don't want it to be too dry on the other hand. So if your worms are too dry, you're not going to be able to breathe, because the worms breathe through their skin. So if it's too dry, the worms aren't going to be able to breathe, and they're going to suffocate, and they're also going to try to get out. So the next thing you want to look for is light. So if there's light getting into your bin, the worms aren't going to like it. Too much light could probably be fatal. Keeping your worms in a bin in the dark basement or garage is ideal to remain healthy levels of light. You want to keep the lid on, you want to keep the light out. They like it dark, they do not like the light. So anything you can do to keep it dark, that's what you want to do. So regardless of your bin, this one here has a cover, so we just put this on it, and that keeps them dark. Next, you want to make sure that your worms are getting a lot of fresh air, a lot of oxygen in here. They need oxygen to breathe. Even though they're under the castings here, they're going to need air underneath this, lots of oxygen in order to survive and be healthy. You want to make sure that you have good drainage holes in the bottom of this bin. This bin has drainage holes in the bottom, so the air is coming in it. It also has a good rim around the sides here to let the airflow come through. If you're making a homemade composting bin for worms, you want to make sure that you drill holes in the side of it, and you want to make sure there's good airflow through your bin. So the next consideration you want to check for is food. So we can see in here we've got apples in here, old apples, and this is food for the worms. Also, the bedding can be food for the worms as well. So anything in here, any bedding or any food, you want to make sure they have enough food to survive. Essentially, a worm can eat a half a pound worth of food for every pound of worms. So each worm can eat half its weight every day in food. So you want to make sure that they're fed well, that they never run out of their food. You always want to be adding in food in here. Another thing you want to keep an eye out for is pH level. The worms should not be too acidic or too alkaline in their bin. You want to shoot for a pH of around 7. Adding more acidic food, according to limestone, is handy ingredient for balancing the pH. So if you get into a point where you feel like the pH is out of whack, you've tested it, it's way too high or it's too low, you can use a little bit of lime in there to bring it back to a neutral balance. So that's something you want to keep in mind. If you're looking at all these things and you don't see that anything else is wrong, check the pH, that may be the issue. So the next consideration is your water. You've got to look at if you're having issues with your water. So your water could have chlorine, and if you're in a city and you're using tap water, there could be chlorine in your water. If you're pouring that consistently into your bin, you're not only hurting the worms, you're hurting all the bacteria, you're hurting all the things in this, basically in the worm bin. You don't want to put chlorinated water in here at all. You want to make sure you have a good quality water source. If you do have chlorinated water and you are in the city, you can leave your water out for 24 hours and this will remove the chlorine out of it, and that should be safe for the worms. Okay, so now we're going to talk about space. So space with your worms, the worms are going to need enough space to live. Worms are pretty good at self-regulating. Essentially, the worms in here are going to self-regulate. There are only going to be so many worms in here as basically the food will allow and the space will allow. So the worms will stop having cocoons if there's not enough space, or if they're not getting enough food, if they're getting stressed out. They may even have more cocoons for a little while just because they're stressed out, which is not good. It means they're trying to keep their population going healthy, and so you want to make sure that you're always watching for the space and make sure that they have enough space to live. So now that we've gone through all those things that could be possibly wrong with your bin and making your worms sick, we're going to talk about what you can do to keep your worms healthy and to bring them back if you've had a catastrophe in your worm bin. So the first thing you could do is you want to act quickly. You want to save the worms. You don't want the worms to die any more that have already died. You want to make sure that you're keeping the worms alive so you can move the whole colony over to another worm bin. So that's the first thing you might want to do. So you might want to move the worms to a new clean bin. Even if you don't have another designated worm bin, you can clean a container, you can clean a bin, you can do whatever you want, and you can move the worms into that. And this is just used in case of an emergency. If your worms are just dying and you don't know what to do, you want to get them out of that bin as fast as you can. The next thing you can do is replace the bedding with something neutral like shredded newspaper, clean bleach peat, or something the worms have liked in the past, or something that has kept them healthy. So you can see in here, these worms, pretty healthy. They're underneath here. They're making a lot of worm castings. They're moving around. They're eating a lot of the stuff in here. So these worms are pretty healthy. You can see that they're moving around and there's no issues with them. They have good color to them. They've got lots to eat in here. They've got bedding. So I notice in here, I've got apples in here. I've got some old carrots, some other stuff in this bin. So another thing about your worms is you want to make sure that you feed them the right type of food. If you're feeding your worms, you want to make sure you're not feeding them any citrus. You don't want to feed them any meats, any dairy, any cheese, anything like that, any oils. The worms aren't going to like that. I've fed them oranges in the past. I've given them an orange or two. But you want to do that in moderation. You don't want to be putting all kinds of lemons in there and oranges and everything else. You want to make sure that you're putting stuff in there that the worms like. I use a lot of apples, cardboard in there. I'll use a lot of scraps from the table like berries, any vegetables that are left over, anything like that. You can put in there for the worms. You can it's up to you. You can either mix it in here, or you can just set it on top and the worms will come up and eat it. So it's kind of up to you how you put it in there, just as long as you don't put too much in there and you don't forget to feed them at all. So you want to make sure you're always feeding them.